changing quickly lately.
Huh.
Seems like everywhere you look, the world's kind of being flipped on its head. Right. And that's exactly why you asked for a deep dive on this whole USAID situation. So let's get into it.
Yeah, what's really interesting to me here is that this isn't just about some simple budget cuts or something. This is way bigger. This is a fundamental shift in power dynamics, and not just here in the US, but globally too.
Right, exactly. It's like President Trump came back into office and was just like, all right, time to clean house. And one of the first things to go, well, USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development.
Yep.
For decades, USAID has been a major player in shaping America's foreign policy.
Yeah. And getting rid of it so suddenly. It sent shockwaves. I mean, all through the international community, world leaders are trying to figure out what this means for them, for their own countries and alliances.
Yeah. And one leader who has been pretty vocal, actually, is Viktor Orban. He's the Prime Minister of Hungary. And he gave a speech recently where he basically said that Trump has turned the world upside down in just a few weeks.
And he specifically pointed to changes in U.S. policy on things like gender issues funding for Soros organizations and how the U.S. deals with illegal migration, even the stance on the Russia-Ukraine war.
Yeah, it really does feel like a whole new playbook is being written. And right in the middle of it all is Elon Musk, right? This whole thing with him and his Department of Government Efficiency, it's being called DOGE, just adds another layer to this whole thing.
It's pretty dramatic. The Guardian article we read described Musk's team as this posse of cocksure young engineers, and they're demanding access to all this classified USAID data, like something out of a movie.
It's been intense, to say the least. Democrats are calling it a hostile takeover by billionaires. Senator Chuck Schumer even compared it to 9/11 in terms of its impact on the Democratic Party.
And that really shows how important USAID was to them strategically. But on the other hand, you have Trump supporters who are thrilled. They see it as draining the swamp, getting rid of a corrupt bureaucracy.
So we've got these two totally different perspectives. How do we make sense of it all? Let's start by breaking down the arguments from both sides.
Well, a lot of people who are critical of USAID point to this weird paradoxical nature of it. It's officially classified as a non-governmental organization, or NGO, but it's entirely funded by the U.S. government.
Yeah, that is pretty strange. How can it be non-governmental if it's basically part of the government?
Exactly. Even Mark Andreessen, the venture capitalist, he said, if an NGO is defined as funded by the government, then every government agency is an NGO.
So is it just a government agency pretending to be something else? And if so, why? What was the point?
That's the question a lot of people are asking, and it gets at the heart of the concerns about what USAID was actually doing around the world. There's this growing belief, especially among Trump supporters, that USAID has been used to push a globalist agenda that's often against American interests.
Interesting. What kind of globalist agenda are we talking about here? Can you give us some examples?
Well, one of the biggest concerns is USAID giving money to media outlets all over the world.
Wait, really? Like which ones?
The BBC is a good example. They've been pretty loud about losing funding from USAID, which raises some questions about media independence.
That's a huge issue. How can we trust that news organizations are reporting objectively if they're being funded by a government agency, even indirectly?
Exactly. It undermines the idea of a free and independent press, which is so important for a democracy. And this is just one example of how USAID was involved in so many things way beyond its official role.
This is feeling a little bit like an iceberg. We're just seeing the tip.
Duh.
But who knows what else is there?
Yeah, I think that's what makes this whole thing so interesting and kind of scary. We're only beginning to understand what USAID was really doing and what the consequences might be now that it's gone.
So where do we go from here? We've got a lot to discuss.
Yeah, we need to understand why this is happening. Look at the claims of corruption and this globalist agenda, and figure out what it all means for America's place in the world.
And we need to figure out what this means for you, the listener.
Yeah.
How will these changes affect you? What should you be paying attention to? Stay tuned, because this is just the beginning.
Before we go any further, I think it's worth stepping back for a second and just thinking about how big this really is. Getting rid of USAID, this isn't just about moving some money around. This could reshape the whole world.
It's easy to get caught up in all the details, but yeah, the big picture is pretty mind-blowing. We're talking about the potential end of the American empire as we know it, the rise of new global powers, a whole new world order.
Right. And to understand where we might be headed, we have to look beyond USAID itself and really examine the forces behind all of this. We talked about this globalist agenda earlier, and I think it's something that a lot of people don't really understand.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. For our listener who might be hearing this for the first time, can you kind of explain what globalism actually means in this context?
Basically, it's this worldview that puts international cooperation and integration above national sovereignty. You know what's best for individual countries? It's often associated with things like free trade, open borders, and weakening traditional nation states.
And why is this seen as a bad thing, especially by people who support President Trump?
Well, the criticism is that these globalist policies end up benefiting the elites and big corporations, and everyday people get hurt. They say it leads to job losses, a decline in national identity, and a weakening of democracy.
So they're saying that USAID, with all its international programs and partners, was actually pushing this agenda instead of helping America.
That's the argument. They point to examples like USAID funding NGOs that are pushing, like progressive social agendas in other countries, often going against what a lot of Americans believe. Or USAID working with international organizations that support climate change policies that could hurt American businesses.
And it goes back to what we were talking about with USAID funding media outlets.
Yeah.
If they're using taxpayer money to support news organizations that are pushing a certain point of view, it makes you wonder about bias and propaganda.
Definitely. It creates a situation where some stories get told and others don't. And that can have a huge impact on what people think and what decisions get made.
So if USAID was really a tool of globalism, as the critics say, then getting rid of it could be seen as a way to take back control for America. Put America first.
Right. It's about putting America's interests first.
Oh,
And this fits with President Trump's America First agenda, which has been a big part of his presidency.
okay, that makes sense. But what about the other side of this? What are the possible downsides to this more nationalist, less globalist approach?
Well, one concern is that it could lead to the U.S. being more isolated and withdrawing from its role as a global leader. This could create a space that other powerful countries like China or Russia could try to fill.
We talked about the BRICS nations before. Brazil, Russia,
Yeah.
India, China, and South Africa. They seem to be forming their own power block and challenging the U.S.
Right. And they're not hiding their goals. They're creating their own financial institutions using their own currencies and making new trade deals that don't involve the U.S. at all.
So if the U.S. takes a step back, will that just make these other powers stronger? And what does that mean for America's future?
That's the big question, isn't it? It's a tough situation. On the one hand, focusing on problems here in the U.S. and making America strong again makes sense. But if the U.S. pulls back too much, it risks losing its influence and power in the world.
And that could have serious consequences for our economy, our security, and our way of life.
Absolutely. It's complicated, and things are changing all the time. There are no easy answers.
So as someone listening to this, what should I be paying attention to? What are the signs that will tell us what direction the world is heading in?
I'd say keep an eye on a few things. First, how the U.S. is interacting with international organizations and treaties. Is it pulling back or getting more involved?
Yeah.
Second, watch the relationship between the U.S. and the BRICS nations. Are they cooperating or heading towards conflict? And finally, pay attention to what's happening in your own community and your own life. Are you seeing changes in the economy, in your social groups, and how the government works?
Those are all good things to watch. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by all this, but we're not just watching this happen. We have the power to shape the future through our own choices and through what we do together. And that's what we'll talk about in the last part of our deep dive. It's amazing how this whole USAID thing has become like this window into all these big changes happening in the world.
Yeah, it really is. It's like a tiny version of this massive transformation that's going on. We've been talking about empires, falling power, shifting, new ideas coming up. It's a lot to take in.
Definitely. And I bet our listeners out there thinking, okay, but what does it all mean for me? How do I deal with all this chaos?
That's the question, isn't it? It's easy to get lost in the big picture, but these global changes are going to affect all of us in our everyday lives.
So where do we even start? What can we do to not just survive, but actually do well in this new world that's merging?
Well, one thing that keeps coming up in all these sources we've been looking at is the idea of being self-reliant and building strong communities. As the old systems break down, we need to create new ways to support each other at the local level.
It's like that idea of building parallel structures that we were talking about with Chris Hedges. Creating our own ways to grow food, produce energy, educate ourselves, even handle our finances.
Right. It's about giving ourselves and our communities the power to be less dependent on these big global systems that are becoming more and more unstable.
So instead of feeling helpless in the face of all this change, we can actually use that energy to create something positive and resilient right where we are.
Exactly. And that's where community is so important. As the world becomes more divided and uncertain, having strong local communities gives us a sense of belonging, purpose, and support.
And it goes back to what Viktor Orban was saying about national identity and having a strong culture. It's about reinforcing the things that unite us and give us shared values and goals.
Absolutely. It's not about shutting ourselves off from the world. It's about understanding the importance of our roots and traditions in a world that's becoming more and more the same.
Okay, so we've got self-reliance, community building, and focusing on our local and national identities. What else? How do we handle the economic uncertainty that comes with all these global changes?
Well, diversifying is key. We talked about the US dollar maybe losing its power, so it might be a good idea to look into other currencies, precious metals, maybe even cryptocurrencies.
Basically, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Spread the risk and make your finances more resilient.
Right. And that applies to more than just money. Diversify your skills,
Yeah.
your knowledge, your ways of making money. The more adaptable you are, the better you'll be able to handle whatever comes next.
You know, it's interesting how this whole conversation has gone from fear and anxiety to feeling empowered and like there are possibilities.
Yeah.
Like by understanding these big changes, we can actually see the opportunities they create.
I hope that's what our listeners take away from this. This isn't about giving in to fear or negativity. It's about understanding that we're living through a really important time of change, and we have a part to play in shaping what comes next.
We're not just along for the ride. We're helping to create the world we want to live in.
Exactly. And with that in mind, I want to leave our listeners with one last thought. Embrace the uncertainty. Don't be afraid to try new things. Challenge what you think you know and explore new ways of living and being. This is a time to be bold, to be creative, and to have hope. The future is unwritten, and it's up to us to write it.
Powerful words. And on that note, we'll wrap up our deep dive into the USAID story and all these changes happening in the world. I hope you found it informative, interesting, and maybe even a little bit inspiring.
Thanks for joining us.
Until next time, stay curious, stay connected, and stay hopeful. We'll see you back here soon for another deep dive into the things that matter most.